but I'm scared to mess with it. All right, I was gonna make you guys like huddle up or something, but first of all, now there's more of you, and as long as you promise to talk back to me, then we're good. Fair? Billy is unconvinced. Okay, well let me pray for us. There is a ton, 12 chapters of Isaiah is no small feat. And we're not obviously going to be comprehensive. Although if you have questions about any parts of it, feel free to bring it up. My style, for those of you who aren't as used to this with me, who aren't a Bible person, I love when people just jump in and talk back. So if you have any questions, like please don't raise your hand. Yeah. Or don't feel obligated to raise your hand. I'm going to be mad if you raise your hand. But just like, yeah, conversation and yeah, there's so much. I'm so excited. Isaiah is my favorite book. I was so pumped when we decided to do that this summer, but it's tricky. There's a lot of hard stuff in there. And yeah, it's just a kind of interesting thing to try to piece together. But yeah, so let me start us and pray for us. And get going. Father, thank you so much for your word and for the chance to dive into this document that is old and sometimes tricky, but Lord, yeah, we trust that you have things to say to us and for us, Lord, as we are responsible and really pursuing, yeah, how your word, your revelation met yeah, your people at this time. And Lord, thank you that you are just incredibly relevant. And so, Lord, we want to honor that this isn't straight to us, but goes through the story of a people that are very distant from us, and yet because you are a God who stands outside of time and space, that we can trust, yeah, that you have something for us tonight. So we invite you here by your Spirit. Amen. Okay, so how many of you either were here last week or watched the video? Okay, so just having half, a little less than half. All right, how many of you read some of Isaiah this past week? Okay, do better. If you have your Bibles, let's open up to Isaiah 1. Isaiah, so Nick talked about last week a bunch of big themes. Does anybody remember kind of like anything you want to throw out there that I'm going to write on the board? And I already should have word black when they're trying to talk like that. Big themes in Isaiah, or things you remember.
Zion.
All right. Yes. Oh my goodness. Anything about Zion or just Zion? You want to stick to that?
Just,
Yeah. Good. What else?
Zion is like the canary of the world. The universe.
Say more.
If Zion faints because of the bad surrounding environment, that means the whole world is going to go.
Good. Absolutely. We'll talk more about that. But that's good. What else?
God's story versus the nation's story.
Yes. Absolutely. And creation, right? We connected that
Yeah.
to creation, right? So competing accounts of creation. And these are really kind of the two central themes. Anything else?
Exile.
Oh, that is a bar. Wait, what was that? Somebody say something?
Oh, I just said exile.
Exile, absolutely. Like in terms of history, right?
Yes.
What about exile?
I think Nick wrote it was a way to frame Isaiah, or it's a way to kind of break it up into sections.
Absolutely. So we have the three pieces, right? That Isaiah covers all three major kind of eras. So pre-exilic, actual exile, right, in Babylon. The southern kingdom is in Babylon, and then the return to the land. So that's critical. What else?
How big a deal exile was.
Yes. Say more.
Just like, Zion is thought to be, if there's one place where God reigns,
Yeah.
he'll never fall. It's Zion, and then Zion
Yeah.
falls, and people are in exile.
Absolutely.
There's no idea.
People are removed.
They've lost all of them,
Totally.
and aren't very hard to see God in that.
Absolutely. So you get something like Daniel 6, right? Where when Daniel prays, he's not just like alone in his room staring at the floor. Like he actually looks out towards Zion, towards Jerusalem, right? He's praying in that direction, which tells us an awful lot about the location of hope for the people, right? Because while they're in exile, there's still this like very conscious dreaming of return to the land. Yeah, Tyler.
Vocation?
Yeah, say more. Well done. Come on, Tyler, you got more than that.
Do I don't know. I think a lot about like Isaiah as like, or
Yeah.
what's the chapter? I can't remember, but it's something with like the angels and like
Yeah.
the hot coals to his lips.
Isaiah 6.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Good. We'll talk about that. Good. This is a good start. Anything else? Yeah, Tyler.
Okay, I just have a lot of thoughts, and I can't like put them all. I was gonna say judgment, but I just
Yes.
I can't like elaborate on that because
No.
there's a ton of judgment in it. I can't like.
All the time. Yeah, absolutely. No, there is. And that will just continue to come up. And there's some tension around that, right? Like that Isaiah, among other things, there's this constant tension between judgment and comfort or deliverance, right? And there's a lot of back and forth, and it sort of feels like there's almost two kind of concurrent threads that run very close together. So we'll see some of that today. Good. Yeah. So Isaiah 1. Does anybody remember what the deal is with Isaiah 1?
It's like the intro to the whole.
It is. It is. And so depending on how you think about how Isaiah kind of came together as a book, Nick, taught last week, and I think I would lean pretty heavily on the idea that Isaiah 1 is sort of an intro that gets added later. So it has a lot of themes, right? There's a bunch of reasons for that. One of the most obvious ones to see is Isaiah 1, right? 1:1, the vision of Isaiah, the son of Amoz, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem, southern kingdom and its capital, right? We'll talk about that. In the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, kings of Judah. So here's who was reigning, here's where it was. Isaiah saw vision, right? Locating him historically. Then at the beginning of chapter 2, the word that Isaiah, the son of Amoz, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem, right? To both get sort of these, preface kind of here's what was happening. And so that, among other reasons, seems to point to the kind of addition of Isaiah 1. But what's interesting about Isaiah 1 is it just picks up a ton, it just picks up a ton of those big themes, right? Already it sort of sets us up for that. So we're not going to really go much into Isaiah 1, but if you read it or if you're skimming it, where do you either see themes we haven't mentioned up here or kind of new themes that you wonder like, oh, is that like going to feature heavily in Isaiah as a whole? What do you think? Jumps out at you in Isaiah 1.
There's a lot of talk about offerings,
Okay.
unclean hands,
Yep.
and then God's plan to redeem them.
Absolutely. Yeah. Good.
So let's talk about God's distaste for offerings that are done with unclean
Yeah.
hands and
Yeah.
not like big like sin.
Yeah. I'm like, yeah. Good. What about Isaiah 9? 1:9, sorry, 1 verse 9. Right, this strong theme of a remnant. I think Nick talked about that last week, but if we didn't, huge theme in Isaiah, right? A remnant. A people, if you studied Romans with us, right? The idea that when kind of this judgment and salvation stuff is going back and forth, there's this strong thread of kind of when the question of like who will be saved, who will be delivered, that there will be a people within Israel, right? And so there's this kind of ever shrinking but sort of steadfast minority, right? Anything else? Yeah.
A theme of prophecies that seem like they can be applied to many different contexts.
Okay.
So the one that stood out to me was 1:8, which is more specific. The daughter of Zion is like a booth in a booth here, and on. It's just has a very clear tone, but it's not entirely clear what it would be referring to.
Right.
It could be like recycled and used on.
Recycled. The recycled prophecies. Absolutely. Yeah. Which is interesting, kind of the prophecy genre as a whole. It's kind of an interesting, like, sort of side, but incredibly helpful thing to think about and ask. And we'll see some of that, right? Kind of like today when we talk about, I mean, the stuff that gets whipped out at Christmas time, right? The virgin shall conceive, right? And it's like, oh, that comes from Isaiah, right? And it has a like present in that time application, which sometimes we don't realize when we use it. When Matthew kind of picks it up in Matthew 1. Yeah, Tyler.
Maybe purification,
Yes.
like
Huge.
verse 25.
Yep.
I will turn my hand against you and will strop away your crosses with lye and rhubarb alloy.
Yep. Good. Yeah.
I think it kind of ties with the remnant,
It
but
does. And also with kind of what Brandon were saying, the Brandons, about offering and like clean hands, right? So even that need for purification. Good. So it's interesting, Isaiah 1 through 12, 1 through 12, is interesting in its structure in that it is, in some points, linear, right? There's some narrative chunks, and in other points it's chiastic, right? Meaning there's a little bit more of like a repetition and sort of a central piece where there seems to be a focus, right? That's sort of A, B, C, B, A kind of a structure, right? And so I think that's so, in some ways structure stuff is like, okay, whatever. But in another way it's interesting because I think 1 through 12 is that way in its message, right? That at points you have a sense of like history, God's doing something and it is moving forward. And at other points you just feel like, oh my goodness, Israel's like stuck, right, in this cycle that keeps repeating. So I think in light of that, the structure tells us something about even kind of like what was happening and the tone that Isaiah finds himself in. And so it's interesting. So if we want to stick with the idea that chapter 1 is, in fact, an intro, Isaiah's writing starts with a super powerful image, right? So Isaiah 2, we're going to start there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull out 2 smaller chunks and then kind of a big chunk, and then we're going to end with a song. So we're kind of doing 4 like little studies, which is a lot and sort of ambitious, but I want to get the breadth of 1 through 12, and I think it will set you up for what's coming, hopefully. And if you haven't read it before, I hope that you go home and read it. Okay, Isaiah 2, 1 through 5. Can somebody read that for me loudly? Go for it. Oh,
no.
he did.
My guy.
Mike, I'm coming for you next.
Okay.
This is what Isaiah, son of Amos, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as chief among the mountains. It will be raised above the hills, and all nations will stream to it. Many peoples will come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, so that we may walk in his paths." The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between the nations, and will settle disputes for many peoples. They will beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war any more. Come, O house of Jacob, let us walk in the light of the Lord.
You know, sometimes when you're watching a movie and the first scene is kind of this powerful image of something that essentially ends up being in the future of most of the action of the movie, right? So much of the kind of rest of the story is a flashback, but it starts with kind of that future scene. It's a little bit of what Isaiah is doing here, right? He is sort of like priming the imaginations of the people, right? With this powerful image. Isaiah this is an incredibly violent time, right? There is a lot of violence in the book of Isaiah because the ancient Near East was a violent place. Like people were like, and it wasn't like, oh, and then we send our soldiers off to war. There was very much this sort of like imminent threat, especially for a nation like Israel, where you were small, you were like tiny, and you just hoped that either you had a friend in the larger nations that were around you and in power, or they forgot about you. Those were like sort of your two options, right? Outside of really God's care, which ends up obviously being Israel's best bet in this time. But there's very much this sense of the threat of violence being super imminent. So what if this is a dream, a vision of Zion, which it is, what is Zion? And I don't mean like what characterizes it, but what actually is it.
Is it Jerusalem?
Okay, it is. Oh. So it's a city, right? What else? Did somebody say a mountain? Somebody said that. No. Well, it's a mountain. There we go. What else? Yeah.
A house.
Yes. And what does house mean in this context?
Temple.
Yes, a temple. Absolutely.
You also think of it as a house as in the dynasty.
Yes, good. Good. So it's a house with a king, right? What else?
The people of God are still faithful to the covenant.
Yes, yes. In Isaiah 51, it's, and I said to Zion, you are my people. Right, so it gets applied, it's symbolic of the people that dwell there, right? Or a people, right? Anything else?
The source of God.
Yes, absolutely. Like, and maybe, certainly the source of his presence. Yeah, good.
And of his law.
What was that?
And of his law.
Yes, absolutely. Right, it's sort of like a school, right? Like, which is interesting. It's like, and the nations are meant to be taught, right? Anything else? The only thing I think we may have missed would be sometimes Zion gets sort of symbolized as the whole of the nation, right? So it is Jerusalem, but in the same way that we can sort of like take a capital and talk about that as sort of symbolizing the whole. So it's interesting. Is Zion like something like New York City, right? Where it in and of itself contains, like when you say New York City, you have a huge semantic range. Like you import a tremendous amount of kind of symbols into that place, right? It's the Big Apple. It's the place, think about Ellis Island, right? This idea of like, it was the place for so long if not as much now, but kind of, where people are coming, right? Immigrants are coming. It's the financial center. Think about Wall Street. It is a place of education. It's sort of the center of the world, right? It's the center of art and culture, right? And so we import a tremendous amount of symbolism into a place like New York. And so Zion's sort of like New York City plus like the Vatican, right? If you're in DC, right? Like all of that sort of, that it kind of has all of these points of reference. And so on one hand, we want to grapple well with the idea, but we also don't want to overly simplify it. Does that make sense? So I'm going to hit on 3 things that I think Zion is, and there are a lot more, but I think these are helpful in kind of framing a conversation about it. So number 1, Zion is central. Right? It is the mountain in the center. And it's not actually in the center, right? Like it's in the center in the same way that New York City is in the center, right? It is, so this idea of Zion being the place where the nations flow, which have you ever thought about how strange, nations flow to, it's up a mountain. Like nothing flows up a mountain, right? Things flow down. So there's this sort of like strange image of like this like gravitational pull upward, right? But this idea that it's the highest of all the mountains, above all the hills. And that's certainly kind of worship language, right? You think about what gets the Israel eventually, but also the nations in trouble is the hills, right? Like the high places are where like idolatry happens, right? And so saying that Zion is elevated as the highest of mountains is a claim about the God of Zion being the greatest. Does that make sense? And so this idea that Zion is the reference point that dominates the landscape. I remember flying for the first time. I'm such an East Coast kid. I've been out to the West Coast like twice. And flying for the first time to Seattle. And I was flying from Spokane, so I was just like this little tiny puddle jumper. And like all of a sudden, out the window, like so unexpectedly, Mount Rainier was right there. And I am emotional, but not like I've never gotten emotional about like a landscape before. I was crying. Oh my goodness, like it's so affecting, right? Like it was majestic and kind of scary and like awe-inspiring, and I just had this moment of like, and then I would hear people talk, like just walking around Seattle. I was out there for my job at the time, and walking around Seattle, and people would be like, the mountains, you know, like people talk about it, and I was like, yeah, it is. Like it was a feature that played prominently in the lives of the people who lived near it, right? It was so clear, right, that it was a part of their daily lives. And so Zion is this mountain that just dominates the landscape. It is the due north of the compass, right? And Isaiah is beginning his proclamation, revelation to the people of God by saying, like, here's your point of reference. Like, here's your due north compass, right? And so Isaiah 2 really kind of is meant to capture the people's attention and just to recalibrate, right? Them towards the vision that even though right now there's a lot of violence in your life and the threat of violence is imminent, that is not God's end game, right? The end game is they shall beat their swords into plowshares, right? It's cultivation of creation. It's peace. It's actually, shockingly to Israel, it's all the nations coming together, right? This isn't just a sort of, this is kind of attempt for the nation of Israel to be supreme, right? It is like God's end game is peace and it's the gathering of the nations, right? And it's His rule. It's learning. It's the ways of God, right? For the people of God. And then there's this plea, right, in verse 5, "In the house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord." Right? So there's this guy, John Levinson, he teaches at Harvard. Is anyone have the class on? He's really, well, I don't know if he's really cool, but he's an amazing scholar. And he says in the ancient Near East, geography is simply a visible form of theology, which is exactly what's happening here, right? Okay, so Zion being central, but also being the place where heaven and earth meets. And this one is obviously heavy on temple, right? That if we talk about, but it's also not just temple in the sense of thinking about like people going to worship a God, right, in visible form, and sort of like doing that and leaving, right? The idea of heaven and earth meeting is the idea of like a God who communicates, right? It's a relational category, right? The place where heaven and earth meet. It's interesting in Isaiah 6, so we are going to jump there briefly right now, actually. Tyler, this is your jam. It all comes together because this was the passage we were talking about. Can you read 6, 1 through 7 for me?
In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the foundations of the thresholds shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphim flew to me, and having in his hand a burning coal that he had taken with tongs from the altar, and he touched my mouth and said, Behold, this has touched your lips. Your guilt is taken away, and your sin is atoned for.
Cool. Pretty famous passage in Isaiah. I'm guessing if you only know 1 or 2, this is probably one of them, right? Where is this happening?
In the temple?
Yeah, absolutely. How do you know?
Mentions the temple.
It does say a little something about the temple. In verse 1.
I didn't say so.
How else?
Verse 4.
There's an altar.
Yes, there's an altar. Yeah, and the house was filled with smoke. What else?
God's presence would be like in the holy of holies.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So this is kind of the temple symbols come to life, right? It's like all of the Exodus stuff, which if you haven't ever read it or haven't read it in a long time, there's tons of symbol, right? There's kind of multiple stages of entrance into God's presence. There's a tremendous amount of purification, but within the Holy of Holies, right, there are things that symbolize God's relationship with his people, and everything is symbolic. Everything points beyond itself, right, to the story of Israel, to the character of God, right? And so this is like Isaiah gets this kind of up close and personal situation where he actually experiences the reality behind those symbols. Right? Because even for the priest who goes in once a year, right, to the Holy of Holies to atone for the sins of the people, he's not coming face to face with the presence of God in the way that it seems Isaiah is here, right? And so it's a powerful, powerful symbol. So this or event, and it's a call event, right? It's Isaiah being commissioned, Isaiah meeting with God. But absolutely, the atoning piece is interesting, right? Because the place where heaven and earth meet presents the problem of the holy God with people whose sins need to be atoned for, right? So we get this kind of Isaiah grappling with what it's like to be in the presence of God, right? And then his need before God, right? In the atonement piece. And so the place where God's name and his presence dwell, right, is certainly in the temple, and they're on display, right, in this incredibly kind of radiant way here in Isaiah 6, but also in Zion, right? The end theme of Zion is the end of Revelation, right? God living with his people, right, in this kind of communicative manner, right? And so all of this kind of imagery points beyond itself to a day when the temple isn't just, right, limited, but the whole earth, the whole picture. Okay, so any questions about that? It's central. It's where heaven and earth meet. Yeah.
Just about Zion in general, is it primarily something that's future-oriented, like in Revelation 21, or is it something that's like the
Yeah.
church, like it's always evolved,
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
sanctified?
Yeah.
But
That's a great question. Yes to both. Yeah. I mean, I think it certainly has a strong future dimension to it, but I think we have leaned overly heavily on the future orientedness of it, and I actually think I'm increasingly convinced there's a pretty significant current application of science, yeah, which will be fleshed out over Isaiah, but even tonight, hopefully. Okay, number 3, sacred space. So, the idea of sacred space is also this temple idea, but basically gets to be the Zion being related to creation. And so it is Eden-like, right, in the temple. Levinson says the temple is intimately associated with creation, even symbolically within the temple. It is, in a sense, the gateway to life as it was meant to be, unlimited by death, eternal life, sacred time, always new, always just created. Right? And so Zion has sort of this mythological quality, by which I don't mean it's not a real thing. It's when we talk about mythology kind of in the current, it's a tricky, right? Tricky kind of term, but one of the things that means is it stands outside of time, right? And so this idea that Zion is sort of timeless, which again is not to say that it's not a real thing, it's to sort of say it's a controlling metaphor and it's like a realer thing. And so in the same way that Sabbath is sacred time, Zion is sacred space. Okay? So it is the place where things are what they were always meant to be. It's a return to creation. And so in the temple we get all of this kind of imagery related to the Garden of Eden, which is interesting. So it's protected in light of that, which sacred space always is. So think about kind of ceremonial law in the Old Testament, right? You can't go in if you're this and this and this, if you have skin disease, right? Like we look at that and we're like, oh my goodness, why is that? There is a protection of the sacredness and the things as they were meant to be, right? It's not an implication of a person as much as it's a protection of a space, right? And a reminder of what things are meant to be like. So the walls are intact, right? There's protection there. So Levinson says something like, the temple is not a place in the world, but the world in essence, right? It is like sort of this, rather than thinking about it as like this kind of miniature, a little like a fort, right, off in the woods somewhere. It's more like, did you ever make like a diorama when you were a kid, right? It's kind of like that, like more the like, this thing, it has all the pieces, it's just smaller, right? And in that sense, right, but the goal is always the Isaiah 6. is, and it's interesting, the ESV says, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts, the whole earth is full of his glory. It's actually a little bit more like the whole earth will be full of his glory, right? Because certainly the whole earth is not full of God's glory now, right? And it's a pronouncement of the goal of the temple, the goal of Zion, right? Which is that one day the whole earth is the temple, the whole earth is Zion, the whole earth is what it was always meant to be. It's an end game. Does that make sense? And yet, so it is not. So Isaiah 5. Who wants to read 5, 1 through 8? Brandon is so aggressive with the I like it.
Let me sing, my beloved, my love song to someone who's not you. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. Sorry. I messed up. My beloved had a vineyard on a very fertile hill. He dug it and cleared it of stones and planted it with choice vines. He built a watchtower in the midst of it, and he hewed out a vine vat in it. He looked for it to yield grapes, but it yielded wild grapes. And now, inhabitants of Jerusalem and men of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I have not done in it? When I looked for it to yield grapes, why did it yield wild grapes? And now I will tell you what I will do to my vineyard. I will remove its hedge, and it shall be devoured. I will break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down. I will make it a waste, it shall not be pruned or hoed, and briars and thorns shall grow up. I will also command the clouds that they rain no rain upon it. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are his pleasant planting. And he will look for justice, but behold bloodshed, for righteousness, but behold an outcry.
Awesome. Thanks, Brandon. It's kind of an interesting chunk of poetry. So it's actually really beautiful in the Hebrew. And it starts out with this sense of like, I mean, Isaiah's like, let me sing a love song, right? Like there's this sort of like, oh my God. Like I heard the new Justin Bieber song. Like I heard the beginning of it. I guess it's not that new. It's probably not that new. The Love Yourself song. Not that new. Not that new. Okay, it's not new. I'm sorry. The old Justin Bieber song that everybody else has been listening to forever. But you like hear like Biebs, his voice, and you're like, oh, that's so nice. And you're like, that is not nice, right? It's kind of like setting you up for like, oh, this is gonna be so sweet. And he's like, let me tell you a story I have about my girlfriend, you know? And he's like, and then it's like, oh, this went downhill very quickly, right? It's kind of like if you remember the story that Nathan tells David in 2 Samuel, right? He's like, I've got this great story for you. There's this guy, and he's right, stole a sheep, and David gets so upset, right? And of course, the big like reveal is actually you're that guy, and you killed that other guy and stole his wife. And that's sort of what Isaiah is doing here, right? He's saying like he's kind of like luring them in with the beauty, and there's this direct contrast between the beauty of the language and of the form, and what he's actually saying, right? So, wild grapes. So he's saying like, right, the image of a vineyard is a very common image, and it's related to creation. Like this idea that it's both organic, but it has been worked and cultivated. Right? God has come after the nation of Israel. He's claimed them for himself, right? And he has absolutely done a significant amount of work. So actually, when you're planting a vineyard, it takes 2 years in between when you plant and when you actually get a great harvest, right? So God has invested in the nation of Israel in significant ways, right? Claimed them as his people, given them his law, put his name on them, right? And the image is certainly that of when the time for harvest came, when the fruit was kind of shown, it turned out, and it literally is like stinking things, what gets translated wild grapes. Like, yeah, That's much even less glamorous than wild grapes. And it's interesting because the divine judgment comes in the form of a removal of protection, right? Of a taking down of the walls. Right, check out verse 5. I will remove its hedge, and it shall be devoured. I will break down its wall, and it shall be trampled down. I will make it a waste, right? Then there's like a return, kind of what Nick was talking about last week, of decreation. Right? This is the work of decreation. Why? Why is God so upset with Israel? At least here.
Kind of says like he looked for justice, but instead he got bloodshed.
Yeah.
So like he did what he was looking for.
Yeah, I mean, this is like a social commentary for the nation of Israel, right? It is like, here's what I've called you to, justice and righteousness, which is a huge theme in the book of Isaiah. Justice and righteousness, those two words together. Once you start peeling your eyes, you're going to see them everywhere. And the Hebrew word for justice is mishpat, right? And there is a play on words. So it's like, I looked for justice for mishpat, right? Which means, for those of you who are reading the book on power, mishpat means something like the exercise of power. I looked for the right exercise of power. And so there's even a greater implication throughout Isaiah on the leaders, right? On those who are in power. And so the priests and the elders, right? The rulers, and certainly the kings are strongly implicated, right? In the unfaithfulness of the people. Like, God has a tremendous, he is concerned about everyone, but if you have more power, he is all the more concerned that it get used rightly. I looked for justice, I looked for mishpat, and instead, and there was this play on words, and that it's something like, instead I saw mispah, which is, it literally means flowing. I saw flowing blood. Right? This is this like very stark image. Like there is blood flowing in the streets instead of justice. And then righteousness, right, sadet, which is the Hebrew word for it, which if you were with us when we were talking about Romans, righteousness not being so much a holy kind of like purity, personal piety, but relational, right? Righteousness as fulfilling your relational obligations, right, to God, to one another. It's how one lives in community, right? And in response to the Creator, right? I looked for righteousness, and instead, and there's another plan where it's like, instead of tzaddik, I saw tzada, which is an outcry, right, of pain or indignation. And it's interesting because that word shows up when the nation of Israel was in Egypt, and it says God heard their cry and he responded, right, and pulled them out of exile, right? So it's now applied to, I'm hearing an outcry against you. The nation that I saved when they cried out now has outcry against them. Right? So there's this like terrific irony going on here. Like, they've absolutely forgotten their story. They've forgotten what they were called to. Right? Those who are in power have forgotten their obligations to one another and to God. Right? It is a social commentary. And God is very unhappy. And so throughout the book of Isaiah, you get things like Isaiah 58. We can't look at all these, and we'll certainly get there later this summer. But all of Isaiah 58 is kind of even picking up on some of the themes we saw in Isaiah 1, right? Of this sort of approach to personal piety, like people are fasting, and then they are asking God, like, why aren't you doing anything? We're fasting, we're like having a quiet time, right? We're doing what we think you're asking of us. And he says in halfway through verse 3 of Isaiah 58, in the day of your fast you seek your own pleasure and you oppress all your workers. There is no justice and righteousness. You fast only to quarrel and fight and to hit with a wicked fist, right? You're violent. Fasting like yours this day will not make your voice to be heard. That there's always a connection for the people of God with how they relate to one another and how, like, God hears them, right? Because if the nation, right, like throughout Exodus, we get the language of, why are you going to treat your slaves well, right? Because when you were slaves, I came after you, right? And so you do things differently. Why does there need to be justice in the land, right? Because I'm a just God, and you need to act like me, you need to image me, right? Why do I care so much about the poor and marginalized? Because, hey, remember when you were poor, right? Like, there is just this constant, remember your story, right, and act accordingly. And so when Israel starts to get off track, God's like, you've just completely forfeited your identity and become concerned with yourself. Earlier, kind of in our passage, there's this talk about joining house to house, right? Which essentially means people get involved in their own stuff and they start like accruing wealth for themselves, right? And it's, one of the commentators talks about like, it's just kind of, it's sort of the American dream in Israel, right? It is I'm like building my own little kingdom and not worry about what's going on in the world. And so not only is it a misuse of power, but it's an abdication of power, right? It's an abdication of responsibility and abdication of justice. Yeah, Molly.
I think one of the striking images in Isaiah 5 to me is this image of the wealthy drinking to excess and then the poor being parched to excess. And it's just a sense of like extreme economic injustice, just like continuing to like widen this like obliviousness to what the excess is doing.
Absolutely. Yeah. Anything else? Any other thoughts or comments?
Just one.
Yeah.
And then I just think it's powerful that is connected to violence. Right, that whole image is more of violence, that the words this Israel people that is going, and that all this kind of injustice that's not like technically violence is carries with it that
Sure.
connotation.
Absolutely, like the passivity.
Violence.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, an active image to connect to what may seem like a passive orientation. That's good. Okay, Isaiah 7. So here's kind of the big chunk. We'll do Isaiah 7 through the beginning of chapter 9. And then finish up with Psalm 48. Okay, so this is a pretty significant narrative chunk. So here's what happens. Who's the major king at this point? Hezekiah comes later. Who's Hezekiah's dad? Ahaz. Absolutely. Ahaz. Okay, so Ahaz, king of which one? Northern or southern? Southern, yes. Judah and Benjamin, so the southern kingdom, and called Judah, usually, right? Okay, so here's the situation. You've got Syria, and the northern kingdom, which is called Israel, right? So the king of Israel and the king of Syria basically have formed an alliance because Assyria is like rapidly gaining power and very scary, right? And so it's like, what are we going to do? And so that was like a very typical thing. It's like nations start connecting and being like, hey, I'll protect you if you'll protect me, right? And so that's happening. And so they come down, and it's interesting in verse 2 of chapter 7, when the house of David was told. So there's this reminder of the southern kingdom is ruled by the Davidic king, meaning the line of David, right? David and then Solomon, and then the kingdom splits. And the southern kingdom they're actually like following the succession in the line of David, okay? So Ahaz's great-grandfather is David. The Davidic line. The house of David was told, Syria is in league with Ephraim, which is the northern kingdom. And the heart of Ahaz, right, the heart of the king and the heart of his people shook as the trees of the forest shake before the wind. Like, it is not, he is scared. Understatement, right? Very, very scared. And so what happens? Yahweh says to Isaiah, go out to meet Ahaz. Right? So there was probably some kind of a relationship. Take your son, who you have named a remnant shall return, right? Which is, Isaiah, bless his heart, he's got a couple interesting things going on there. That poor kid, right? And he says, take him with you as like a reminder, right? Because every time you say his name, Ahaz is going to be like, yeah, I get it. And go to what essentially was like the water supply, which, because we don't think like ancient Near Eastern kings, we don't know that when he's saying the end of the conduit of the upper pool on the highway to the washer's field. You're like, where is that? Well, who knows? But it is the place where they're getting their water, right? And water plays kind of an interesting symbolic role in Isaiah, but it also played a very practical role for them of just like, we need to make sure that if we're laying siege, that we have enough water. So he's basically just surveying the situation, probably. And Isaiah, as Old Testament prophets are wont to do, seizes the symbols around him. And he's like, there's this calm water. And he says to Ahaz, be careful, be quiet. By which he doesn't mean don't talk, right? But like, be still. Do not fear, and do not let your heart be faint. Because of the two smoldering stumps of firebrands, at the fierce anger of Rezin in Syria, and the son of Remaliah, because Syria with Ephraim and the son of Remaliah has devised evil against you, saying, let's go up against Judah and terrify it, and let us conquer it for ourselves, and set up this guy as king, right in the midst of it. Which doesn't seem very encouraging yet. So be careful, don't fear. That sounds like reason to fear. But God says, it shall not stand, it shall not come to pass. The head of Syria is Damascus. The head of Damascus is Rezin, meaning the king, right? And within 65 years, Ephraim will be shattered from being a people. And then it says, the head of Ephraim is Samaria. The head of Samaria is the son of Remaliah. And he ends with this, if you are not firm in faith, you will not be firm at all, right? That there's this incredible kind of moment of, like, what am I going to do? And all of a sudden, like, things have gotten very real very quickly, right? Like, this guy is in a pickle, right, to say the least. And so Isaiah, as kind of the word of the Lord comes to him, and in that moment, like, Ahaz really has a decision to make, right? And so 2 Kings 16 gives us a lot more detail about what happens, but in the meantime, right, what happens, what does Isaiah say to Ahaz? It's kind of a weird moment. Yeah.
Like what happens right
Yeah,
next after,
yep.
Isaiah says that like God wants him to test God.
Yes, which is interesting, right?
Yeah.
He says, ask for a sign. And what does Ahaz say?
He's like, no.
No, that's okay. Like, I don't want to test God, right? And it's this, and then Isaiah says, like, is it too, like, he gets frustrated. Is it too little for you to weary men that you weary my God also? And then he gives them a sign, right? And so there's a sense of, right, it's not actually Ahaz testing God, it's God testing Ahaz, right? Saying, like, where's your heart, right? That moment of, like, where are you going to choose to operate in faith or not, right? And there's very much sort of this, like, apparently not. And so the sign of Emmanuel is interesting, right? It says, okay, here's going to be your sign. A virgin or a young woman will conceive and bear a son, and she'll call his name Emmanuel, which means, first, God is with us, right? And we hear that and we think, Christmas, and we're like, that's such great news. And it's like good news and it's not good news, right, at this point. It is, God is with you, and he's doing something, but as a direct result of Ahaz's lack of faith, right, like, things are turning bad very quickly. And so God being with you is sometimes good news if you're firm in faith, right? But God being with you if you're not firm in faith is judgment, right? Jesus comes and says, like, I've come with a sword, right? Like, that there is a very real, always when God shows up, both, like, deep encouragement and the opportunity for judgment, right? And that never changes. It never changes. That is always the story of God, both pieces, right? And so the question of kind of what this looks like is, he essentially, so in 2 Kings 16, we get this very, actually, let's turn there. Yeah.
I was just gonna say something about the sign the young woman will conceive.
Yeah.
I read that
Yeah.
it's kind of like a sarcastic remark. Like, if you're not gonna ask for a sign, here's a sign. The young woman's gonna have a child.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, scholars think that what God was saying when Isaiah says, "Ask him for anything you want," anything, high as, what does he say? Something about like high as the heavens, let it be deep as Sheol or high as heaven. That there's an implication that like ask for something supernatural. Right, like ask for a miracle, right? And then there's kind of like you want another kid with another name, you know, like in the sense of like maybe it was a virgin or maybe it was a young woman. It's kind of unclear. There are people that go different directions on, was it Isaiah's wife? Was it Ahaz's wife? Like, was it some random person? Probably it was at least someone where the kid was present, right? Like in the palace or near the palace, right? And so this idea of, I think we were talking about this as staff the other day, and I was saying like, there's just something so mundane, and every time someone calls that kid's name, you're like, God's with us. God's with, right? Like it is this like very present reminder of God's presence. And again, like for encouragement or for challenge. But yeah, I think he had the opportunity to really ask for something remarkable and he missed it. That's just my feeling. Any other questions about that? Because how many of you like knew that there were kind of like that there was an Isaiah kind of piece of this before Jesus? Meaning like that what Matthew is drawing on is earlier as an earlier manifestation. Yeah, it's surprising, right?
So we should read the content in this book.
Yes, I think so. So often with prophecy, right, this idea of kind of John Goldgate goes the direction of there's meaning and significance when you're talking about prophecy. So there's an original meaning, right, that was like actual. But you can do this with narrative as well. I think it applies both ways. That it means something in the context to the people. Those are real people who receive that in a particular way. But significance can be evolving. And we see that all the time, sort of in dual fulfillment or multiple kind of fulfillment of prophecy. Yeah.
It seems like faiths that have been born out of Hebrew Bible suffer from the ambiguity that the meaning versus the significance distinction can create. So maybe I read something and I say that it ends New Testament, but then somebody 700 years later comes along and says, wait, no, like I'm going to interpret it this way, and add new significance onto this text that has these meanings you couldn't possibly have understood just from those texts alone. And then 1,000 years later, somebody else does the same thing.
Yep. Yes. Yeah.
So how being one of the faiths that's in that convention, how do you say, like, no, but I know that I'm totally right unambiguously.
Such an easy question.
By dropping the plan.
Sorry.
Yeah. I think you stay somewhere in the middle. I think there has been a sense of wanting to make symbolize everything, right? Of like clearly everybody I've heard a lot of people, and I have even thought like Jesus shows up and like why didn't everybody just know? It's like these were legitimate scholars at the time who knew their Old Testament and see Jesus and go like that's not the guy, that we've been waiting for. And so and yet I think there is some real sense of certainly the kind of overall trajectory. And so I think that's where, like, leaning heavily on any one point is always going to get everybody in trouble, right? In the sense of that there is a level of just like, okay, like not having our faith stand or fall on the fulfillment of one exact kind of prophecy in a way that we expect. Now that being said, I think, that there is a significant kind of like sense of like collection, right? Of like, okay, overall, like how do we understand like what God was anticipating these people to expect? How do these people expect? But it's tricky. I mean, all I have to say is really tricky. Yeah.
It's just a general question
Yeah.
about prophecy. What does it mean for a prophecy to be fulfilled if the author only intended it for that time? So like we now can look back and say,
Yeah.
connect the dots between something that Isaiah wrote in
Yeah.
context and something that happened later.
Yeah.
But if he had no awareness of what would happen in the future, how do we say that something was fulfilled
Yeah.
if it wasn't?
Yeah. Now that I think is just clearly like it's the word of the Lord. And so when the prophets speak, they say they interpret themselves as speaking for God.
Oh, sure.
And so I think they would, I just think there's a sense in which they really stand apart from the message in a way that I think gives a ton of freedom to say, like, God's doing what he's doing. And there's just a very level of obedience on the part of the prophet and of just like bringing it into the community and trusting God. Yeah.
We think the word fulfill is having sort of meaning of
Yeah.
being filled with new meaning, being filled with significance. Like
Yeah.
this
Yes.
verse 14,
Yeah.
that's something at a place when Jesus came and he gave that a whole
Yes.
new level.
Yes. Yeah. I absolutely think that's fair. Appropriate. That's good.
So it's not like it was empty before it was filled.
Correct. Yeah. Yeah, just a kind of an additional and deeper. Okay, 2 Kings 16. What happens with that? Ahaz. So before we go there, so God's presence as we get this kind of interesting water imagery that I had mentioned, and it kind of shows up interestingly in chapter 8. I'm going to jump there briefly. And so this is again part of God's this kind of like dual judgment and salvation, judgment and deliverance. In verse 5 of chapter 8, the Lord spoke to me, meaning Isaiah, again. Because this people has refused the waters of Shiloh that flow gently and rejoice over Rezin and the son of Remaliah. Therefore, behold, the Lord is bringing up against them the waters of the river, mighty and many, the king of Assyria and all his glory, and it will rise over all its channels and go over all its banks, and it will sweep on into Judah. It will overflow and pass on, reaching even to the neck, and its outspread wings will fill the breadth of your land. Oh, Emmanuel, right? To whom he's speaking either to the child, right? Or I think to the people who are meant to understand themselves as the people with whom God is, right? But there is very much, again, this sense of what I offered you was the waters of, like calm waters of faith that represented Zion, right? That part of this like Edenic imagery connected to Zion is, right, do you remember in the account of Eden, it's like 4 rivers come together, right? And there's this like, they flow out and there's this very much kind of this peaceful like picture of a well-watered land, right? And God's saying like, that's what I offered you, but in judgment, like that same substance is now becoming an instrument of your judgment. So he taps into that again, right? That imagery. And so we get something like that even like in baptism, right? Where water is both symbolic of judgment, of death, but also of salvation and purification. And so these kind of keeping in mind what like this creation, decreation, right? The flood, right? Imagery of decreation, of an instrument of judgment, but also can be an instrument of blessing and salvation. And so there's constantly kind of that interplay, which I think is interesting. Okay, so Ahaz. Oh man, it's rough. So basically, here's the deal. In verse 6 of 2 Kings 16, we get the real story. Verse 7. Ahaz sent messengers to the king of Assyria, and what does he say? I am your servant and your son. The Davidic king of Israel said, I am your servant and your son to a pagan king. That is, like, we should read that with, ugh. Like, that is language of, like, allegiance, but it's also language of identity. I mean, right, like, Psalm 2 is the Davidic king, like, hears from God, like, you are my son, right? That language gets applied to the king, right? And so when we see even that Jesus' baptism, that's partially a kingship, like, it's a coronation, right? That this moment is just, like, not, so I think one of the things that I've been struck with, right, there is no separation of church and state in the ancient Near East, in case you haven't noticed, right? But there's a sense of, like, you don't make political alliances that aren't also religious alliances, right? It just doesn't happen. And so there is this, in not standing firm in faith, like, he absolutely forfeits his identity, right? As the one on whom God has said, like, the Davidic line will continue forever. The 2 Samuel 7, right, kingship promise is that God will always put one of David's descendants on the throne forever and ever, right? And Ahaz knows this, right? And yet he gets scared and nervous. And he is not firm in faith, right? And it has disastrous results. So he says this to the Assyrian king, and then he, like, hangs out in the capital with him, and he sees the temple. And he, in chapter 16, he sends plans back home to the priest and says, like, we need to renovate the temple so our temple looks like their temple. And they start, like, remaking the altar. It's like this, like, unbelievable sort of, like, recalibration of the Southern Kingdom of, like, hey, you know what's really cool? Like, what they've got going on in their temple, like, guys, like, we could do it. It's like fixer-upper in Southern, you know, in the Southern Kingdom. And there's just this, like, sort of, like, collective forfeiture of everything that Israel's meant to be, right? So, Ahaz is not a positive figure, needless to say. And so, you can imagine that Isaiah, who is just features so strongly as a real kind of character in this section, right? And he basically is like, oh, well, so that's the background for what's kind of the action that's happening here. And we then get, like, well, now the Assyrians are they're coming for you. Like, the people that you have aligned yourself with and that you have sort of, like, given your heart and loyalty to are now gonna overtake you. And I mean, isn't that the way it works, right? Like that he can't sort of manage his own fate after, kind of forfeiting everything. Yeah, it's incredibly tragic. So, in verse 3 of chapter 8, Isaiah and his wife have sex, basically. And I went to the prophetess, and she conceived, and I bore a son. And then the Lord said to me, here's another name. And he basically names his son, the spoil speeds, the prey hastens. Which means something like, it's about to get bad. Right? Like, Assyria is coming. They're coming for you. And he says, before he knows how to call you mom and dad, the wealth of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria will be carried away before the king of Assyria. So the two that have made an alliance, which is what he had originally promised, right? But now they're also coming for you. Like once Assyria gets them, they're coming for you, and exile is on its way. And so it's an interesting, we're in such a bizarre time, right, as a nation, and there's sort of an untouchableness to it, and so I don't want to at all claim that we're in a similar spot. But I've been so interested by the second half of Isaiah 8. So let me read it and then we can just briefly talk about it. For the Lord spoke to me thus, right, spoke to Isaiah with a strong hand upon me and warned me not to walk in the way of this people, right, saying, do not call conspiracy all that this people calls conspiracy, and do not fear what they fear, nor be in dread. But the Lord of hosts, him you shall honor as holy. Let him be your fear, and let him be your dread. And he will become a sanctuary and a stone of offense and a rock of stumbling, right? Jesus picks up that language later. To both houses of Israel, a trap and a snare to the inhabitants of Jerusalem, right? There's the theme again. God as deliverer, but also God as the one who brings judgment. And many shall stumble on it, they shall fall and be broken. They shall be snared and taken, right? And he says, bind up the testimony, seal the teaching, by which he means what God has revealed, right, among my disciples. And then this is Isaiah's declaration of faith. I will wait for the Lord, who is hiding his face from the house of Jacob, and I will hope in him. Behold, I and the children whom the Lord has given me are signs and portents in Israel from the Lord of hosts, who dwells on Mount Zion. And when they say to you, right, he's teaching, right, his disciples, Isaiah, the people who are hanging around Isaiah, anyone who will listen, essentially, and saying, when people tell you to go inquire of the mediums and the necromancers who chirp and mutter, right, people want to know what's happening. It's a time of incredible uncertainty, right? Like, people are asking a lot of questions, and then Isaiah's like, this is insane. Should not a people inquire of their God? Should they inquire of the dead on behalf of the living? And then he says it again, to the teaching and to the testimony. God has already revealed himself. Right? Like, God is talking to you, and you're not listening. If they will not speak according to this word, it's because they have no dawn, right? They're not enlightened. They will pass through the land greatly distressed and hungry. When they're hungry, they will be enraged and will speak contemptuously against their king and their God, and turn their faces upward. They will look to the earth, but behold distress and darkness, the gloom of anguish, for they will be thrust into thick darkness. And then you get a pronouncement of coming salvation. But there will be no gloom for her who is in anguish. In the former time, right, so he's shifting. He's saying, like, currently things are really bad, and the remnant is small, and the faithful are small, and it's much more enticing to go, like, pay, like, the psychic down the street to try to figure out what's going on, and for you to, like, believe, right, and then respond to God in kind of what he's revealing. But he says, and in the former time, meaning it used to be true, and it is true, right, at that point. He brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, right, the land of Israel, right around them. But in the latter time, he has made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations, right? And certainly that gets picked up in the New Testament as a place where Jesus began his ministry, right, as a direct reference to this passage. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwell in a land of deep darkness, on them has a light shone. And the question is, what's this light, right? And certainly we're like, Jesus. But check out verse 6. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, which I think is just drawing on the fact that there's a coming, we've seen all these children born with these names that are related to judgment, right? And so there's a sense of like, but there's another child coming, right? To us a son is given, the government shall be on his shoulders, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. of the increase of his government and his peace, there will be no end. On the throne of David, right? The reestablishment of, you have Ahaz, who has absolutely denied his identity and in theory sort of ended the dynasty, right? On the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and uphold it, what? With justice and righteousness, right? Not with Isaiah 5, like the vineyard that's been destroyed, right? And no justice, no righteousness, bloodshed and outcry, right? This throne will be established with justice and righteousness from this time forth forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. So there's this call back, right, to the plan of God and what he's up to, but also in the time, a call to faith, right? And a call to the Word of God, right? Yeah, so exciting, but certainly a mixed bag. Any thoughts, questions? Yeah, so Zion being so connected to the dynasty or the house of David, right? At different points, like, we should feel the precariousness of Zion in Isaiah, and that Ahaz is certainly one point, right? Where it's the question in a very real way of like, can this, how will the nation of Israel fare in light of the unfaithfulness of its king in such an egregious way? We do have a few minutes on in here, just because I love it. Psalm 48. Yeah, Tyler.
Just quickly, I was gonna ask, like, how does the line continue if Ahaz, like, voluntarily surrenders
Yeah,
his identity to,
yeah,
the city?
yeah. Yeah, and then, I mean, you end up with kings in exile, right? Like Ahaz is not the end of the line, but he's pretty close. And then, of course, there aren't really any kings in exile. And so the idea of the 2 Samuel 7 promise, that there will be someone on the throne of David forever, I think essentially gets picked up with Jesus. But there is a very real sense in which like, there is no king in Israel for a while. And so the forever and ever, I think we're meant to read in sort of the prophetic, like, kind of symbolic, like, rule sense over the long term, rather than like Israel will always have a physical king sitting on a physical throne. And it's like, and that's where it's kind of like the Zion piece, right? Like, and that's where the prophetic genre is tricky, because in some sense there's like such a reality to it, but there's also like the symbolism, features so prominently in it. So for a while, Israel doesn't have a king, and then we get in the beginning of Matthew, the line of Jesus is essentially Joseph is a descendant of David, which becomes critical. But Judah is always carries the royal line, right? So, it would have really been problematic had Jesus not been of the tribe of Judah.
In chapter 9,
Yeah.
in terms of the person that the verses are describing,
Yeah.
is there a more recent historical figure in their context that it's referring to?
Yeah,
Or is it?
that's a great
Because
question.
it obviously leans pretty heavily in the distant future, which we now see as Christ. but-
Yeah, I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the increase of his government piece, there will be no end. I mean, they certainly would have seen that as a king figure, right? It's all kinds of language about government. And because there just doesn't end up, I would imagine in a similar way to, even immediately after, like very early on in Genesis, you have people being named with like a tremendous amount of hope being placed on their name, where you think like they're hoping that this person's going to turn things around, And so I think at the time there was this hope like, like, maybe Hezekiah will turn this around, you know, or whatever, but yeah, I don't know if there's any direct connection. That's a great question. So there are several songs that are Zion focused. And I would just, I'll end here because I think devotionally it's so wonderful. And just sort of a kind of circling back to the idea of Zion. I'll just read this. And in prayer, great is the Lord and greatly to be praised in the city of our God, his holy mountain. Beautiful in elevation is the joy of all the earth. Mount Zion in the far north, the city of the great king. Within her citadel, God has made himself known as a fortress, a protective. For behold, the kings assembled, they came on together. As soon as they saw it, they were astounded. They were in panic, they took to flight. Trembling took hold of them there, anguish as of a woman in labor. By the east wind you shattered the ships of Tarshish, which were just like a symbol of power. And then there's so much of this in Isaiah, of the contrast between hearing and seeing. One of the things that Zion absolutely is the place where what is heard, right? Such a strong emphasis in Hebrew scripture on what is heard, right? The written word, the spoken word, where what is heard is actually seen. As we have heard, so we have seen. Right? Where faith becomes sight, where hearing becomes seeing, Zion is that place. Right? It was that place for Isaiah and Isaiah 6. It's the place when Jesus shows up, as we have heard, so we have seen. Right? Like in what we hope for, right? As Christians, like as we have heard, like I cannot wait until the day what I have heard becomes what I see. As we have heard, so we have seen. In the city of the Lord of hosts, in the city of our God, which God will establish forever. We have thought on your steadfast love, O God. And that word thought is actually a verbal form of like image. And so it's actually something where like as we have imagined, like as we have like imaged in our minds, on your steadfast love, O God, in the midst of your temple. And I think that's connected to us, like in the midst of your temple, in the midst of your people, right? As your name, O God, so your praise reaches to the ends of the earth. Your right hand is filled with righteousness. Let Mount Zion be glad. Let the daughters of Judah rejoice because of your judgments. Walk about Zion, go around her, number her towers, consider well her ramparts, go through her citadels, right? Hang out there, right? In the temple where the people of God are, where God and where heaven and earth meet, that you may tell the next generation that this is God, our God forever and ever. He will guide us. We pray. God, thank you that, you are a God over space. You're a God over physical space in the way that we experience it. You're a God over metaphorical space, over reality that's more real than even what we kind of experience now. And so Lord, we look to that day. I look forward to a fully realized Zion. And I thank you that there was and is now a faithful king on the throne of David. And so Lord, we just praise you for this time in your word this summer, for this time in your word tonight. I pray for my friends here. I pray for just flourishing and blessing in every way on them. They would know you to be a God who is in your